Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the OMNIA Performance Podcast with myself, Fergus.
Myself, Jonny.
And the real Dr. Phil. Say hello to your adoring fans all over the world, Phil.
Hello, everyone.
Hello to you two.
Were you the adoring fans?
Say hello to your adoring fans. Hi, Mum.
Yeah. Anyway, I was kind of hoping that somehow we could edit in Dr. Phil's voice, like the TV Dr. Phil there, but we're off on a tangent before we even began. So let's scale things back.
I shouldn't try my American accent, so.
And you need more of a moustache. Although the time,
podcast.
We're almost there. Will you be growing a moustache for November this year, Phil?
I don't know. I haven't done it in a while, but maybe.
Under pressure now, mate.
Yeah, no,
because if you say no, people will just think
I've shaved my head with it.
We didn't. Bronson, we didn't ask you to do that.
I did that, didn't I? Do you remember when I looked horrible? Shaved my head, had a moustache. This is a massive digression, but shaved my head, had a moustache, and had a tooth missing. I went to a grappling competition, and the other guy refused to fight me.
I know that photo.
He wouldn't do it. He ran away. So there you go.
Yeah, he flew home, didn't he?
He flew cross-continentally to get away from me. So I'm not fighting him. Fuck this.
Okay, well,
so
now that Johnny's ego has been appeased, and we all know that he's hard as nails.
Well, not with this haircut.
To be fair, the photo I've seen, you were very lean, you were missing a tooth, and you were very bald, so it was quite intimidating.
It was quite horrible.
But this is the longest and least coherent intro we've ever done to any of these podcasts, so apologies for that, everyone. But to summarise, Johnny is the hardest man here. I think we knew that. Phil is going to shave his head and grow a moustache, and I need to get better at hosting introductions on this podcast. So, with that in mind, if you would like a more concise, more detailed insight into the things that we are going to discuss on said podcast, then please head to the show notes below where you can access OMNIA Performance's premium offering in Circle, where we have a whole load of educational things going live. Well, they've gone live, in fact. A lecture a month from the real Dr. Phil, the skinhead moustache man. A seminar from Jonny and I each month focused on things like resilience, on how to nail your kit planning for big events, how to optimize routines around hybrid training, things like that. We also have a live Q&A every month. We have a research database. We have premium podcast features and premium chat rooms. There's a whole lot going on, and we'd love if you were all involved. Yeah. And for our existing athletes, if you are not already in Circle, then please do get involved, because that's the place that we have consolidated everybody into one group. So it'd be great to have you there as well. So podcast stuff, follow, subscribe, share with friends, rate, review. Thank you very much. And just a reminder, all the episodes are available on YouTube as well if you are a visual listener, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but there's another tangent opportunity there. So we will move forwards and discuss the differences between hybrid training and CrossFit. And this isn't going to be as inflammatory as some of you might have otherwise hoped, but we're just going to discuss the considerations that we have from an almost definition point of view.
Yeah.
And then actually, what are the practical changes? What are the differences in demand? What are the differences in adaptation from a research and a physiological point of view from Phil's perspective? And ultimately, where's the crossover? Because there is a lot of crossover, and there are some people out there, I've seen it in YouTube comments saying, well, hybrid athletes are just CrossFitters. Arguably not. Not all hybrid athletes are CrossFitters. Some CrossFit athletes might sing to more disciplines than other, but CrossFit is a discipline in and of itself, which is something we'll get onto. But why don't we go around the room and summarize how we see the difference? I'm sure there'll be a lot of crossover. I might be wrong. I hope there's not, because then we can start a vicious, angry debate where we've already established that I'd need to be bald and have a moustache to even contend. But bottom line is, from my perspective, is that CrossFit blends disciplines into a new discipline, which means that you can become proficient in more things than one, but ultimately your progression is in the blend. So there is a ceiling to how much you can develop in the components of CrossFit in pursuit of CrossFit itself, whereas hybrid training is training each individual discipline concurrently with a view to progressing the metrics within that discipline as you go. And whilst there might be some crossover in one supporting the other, you are looking at the metrics of those disciplines in and of themselves. So CrossFit is a blend, hybrid training is the individual disciplines in and of themselves. Not as succinct and concise and eloquent as I thought it would be, but I gave it my best shot. Johnny, your turn.
I'm not even going to add to it. Honestly, you didn't think that was succinct, but I did. I thought you nailed it, in actual fact, because the difference is in what CrossFit is, and CrossFit is supposed to be this kind of randomized idea. Now, I know that they've moved past that to a certain degree in terms of programming things, but The competitions themselves are still essentially, you're blind to what's happening.
Turn up
Go in,
prepared and
turn up ready to do
see if you
anything,
can survive.
and let's see what happens. So you have to, by that very definition, be good at quote unquote CrossFit, as opposed to being good at, A, B, and C in this kind of concurrent manner. And I think that blend, as you've described it, is a perfect way to really kind of differentiate between the two. Because, as you said at the very start of it, there is a good argument, and I wouldn't argue against it too much, that CrossFit it's hybrid to a degree. But the principles of what we're actually trying to suggest or trying to do or trying to help people achieve within our kind of hybrid niche, if you like, are slightly different based on that kind of characteristic that you described. So unless, Phil, maybe you want to, maybe you got your own definition. Let's start with that, and then we can dive into some of the nitty-gritty after that.
The main difference for me would be the number of skills that you need to be very proficient at. So with hybrid training, obviously, if you choose your hybrid goals, you might have one strength one, you might have one endurance one. You are only really focusing in two main areas. So even though they're kind of opposites, from a skill perspective, you still have a bit more time to focus developing on them. So you'd like to think that more time, you'd be able to develop more there. Whereas with CrossFit, you've got to be both strong and have good endurance, a bit like hybrid, but you also need to be proficient across a number of skills. So that could be, you've got gymnastics, you've got weightlifting, you've got on the rower, you've got on the ski erg, all of those different things which require lots and lots of practice to be very efficient at them. And you just don't have the time. So because of that, you're going to be a generalist. Even though you're going to be a generalist in both hybrid training and CrossFit, I feel like you can probably be better at your individual goals in hybrid training because you're spending more time to get more efficient at them. You're only trying to go for two key goals, whereas you don't know where those goals are going to come in CrossFit because you don't know what the events are going to be. So then you've got to be proficient across a load of different things. That means you're reducing the amount of time you're going to train on all these individual components. So you're going to get fitter, stronger, yes, but you probably, if let's do a direct comparison. Say I wanted to lift a 300 kg squat and do a marathon row. Okay, I can spend hours getting better at that. I reckon the hybrid athlete that focuses on that is going to be better than the CrossFit athlete who does a marathon row in competition, but they're kind of utilizing some skill training on it, some endurance that they've developed through their training to be able to perform at that particular event. So yeah, that's probably the difference between me, that you've gone from two key areas versus lots of areas that you don't necessarily know are going to come up in competition. So
yeah.
They're both the training for both would be technically quite different because of that.
Yeah, I think you're right to really highlight the fact that there's so many different skills going on as well that you have to try and encompass into your training program. And I think something else that's worth saying, and again, sometimes we've come across, but much less than not, sometimes we've come across boxes or particular training programs where aerobic training is seen as an overall tool and part of the training as opposed to kind of a means to an end. I guess what I'm trying to say is you mentioned a marathon row there in amongst your own description. And if we were to be looking after people who were looking to do something like a marathon row, then we'd treat it probably very differently. CrossFit tends to have a kind of a lean towards high intensity. So even if you went into competition and they said, right, today's competition is you're going to have to row for, and this has happened, hasn't it? You're going to have to row for 50,000 meters or something. The requirement there is to do that as fast as possible. And therefore the intensity demand is very different to somebody who might want to kind of capitalize on pacing strategies, et cetera, because they just get in there and smash it as hard as they can. And then they have to try and recover for the next piece, et cetera. So I think some of the cultural lean, shall we say, is much harder towards that high intensity work and at risk of being inflammatory. Which is
I actually think you're being probably more polite than you need to be, because I'll jump in and say that I think CrossFit as a whole misunderstands the concept of quote unquote endurance within an aerobic sense. I think the programming as a whole has framed endurance as anything under 160 heart rate rather than the individual's actual true aerobic zone.
I'm not sure that maybe I'm wrong.
No, they haven't said
yeah,
160,
yeah.
but that's kind of the perception, is because you see, I mean,
Certainly,
I remember during lockdown, most of the CrossFit athletes that I'm sort of friends with know, and they won't mind me saying this, went out for an easy recovery run, heart rate strap on, heart rate for 30 minutes, 171.
Yeah.
And unless your max heart rate's about 300, then that would not, in fact, be an easy recovery run. So I think that what I want to circle back to and make really clear from the off is we are not saying our way is better than their way or anything like that. We're just wanting to highlight the differences, because I think some people think there's more of a crossover than there might perhaps be, in that, yes, CrossFit sessions mean that you're kind of lifting weights. You're also running to that station. You're then running on the woodway and you're onto the rower, which means you're kind of moving, your heart rate's up and you're doing different things. The actual application of that in a more specific setting is very, very different. And that's why I think it's important to really note that Metcons, that style of training, will get you better at that style of training. But the translation to other things, I personally think, has been inflated in terms of how translatable things are. Yes, there's anomalies. There's James Newbury, who did an Ironman very well, is also a very competent CrossFit athlete. There's a few people in the UK I know that have done Ironmans alongside very, very competitive CrossFit. But generally speaking, that comes from a place of applied speciality over time and ultimately genetic application, depending on what they're strong at and how they've responded to things. But randomized CrossFit training does not necessarily make you better at all things. Training those things will make you better at those things. So I think it ultimately comes down to, what do you want to do and achieve? Do you have specific targets and numbers that you would like to box off? Do you want to get a race under a certain time? And then you assess how you want to put that together, because 3 CrossFit sessions a week, if they were programmed around your goals, would be much more efficient than just going in and doing whatever the box was doing. But I think what's very important for recreational training is the community side of things that comes with CrossFit as well. And that's where hybrid training is a complete other end of the spectrum, because it's actually very lonely. You're doing individual sports generally. If you join a tri club as a hybrid athlete, they'll lick you up and down and wonder what you're doing there. If you find some people local to you that you can train with, great. But if we are, as most hybrid coaching plans will have you, working at specific intensities, then you need to find somebody at a specific ability to actually do the prescribed training. So there are real nuances to consider. But I think the real top line point that I want to make today, and we'll discuss this in general terms, is hybrid training will give you a great, if it's an endurance, let's say it's running and lifting, it will give you a great base to move towards CrossFit, to then pick up the skills if you would so like, because the energy systems will be developed enough for you to make that transition a bit more seamlessly. And CrossFit will give you a really, really good tolerance for a threshold work, but I think potentially lacks a bit of the aerobic foundation that would make you better at longer duration running or training for a triathlon or something like that. So
I'd
both
agree
have
with
their
that.
merits, and I think neither prepares you better for the other than the other.
Well, there's my moment to disagree then. Because
Okay.
I think that, and Phil, maybe you can interject here as well. I think that if you were to look at it, from way high up and just kind of look down at the bird's eye view at it, arguably, if you were a hybrid athlete, so let's look at somebody like yourself who's developed a specialism, if you like, or a capability to be more than average in lifting and more than average at an endurance sport. So you can do both those things. Okay, you may not be a specialist in either, but you certainly have a capacity beyond most. If we were to take you and they say, do you know what, we're going to take a respectful run, 2-3 years at putting you through CrossFit. We want to see what would happen if could we get you to the regionals? Could we, whatever the goal might be, then I think you would have a much better chance of achieving that from your starting point as a hybrid athlete, because you've built a strength base and you've built an aerobic base, and then the components that are lacking there can come because you can now put those at a very, very deep maintenance without losing control of them, and you could work on the others.
I think the key there,
your work would be essentially less what Phil was talking about, because you would have less of this big spread of different things you would have to try to do. You can now work on skill and power and threshold predominantly, which would be less than your average CrossFit athlete.
I, in fact, agree, but with the caveat that is only because my background was in strength, and the strength bias that I have has given me the ability to hold on to that whilst I've built everything elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I think for my specific example, having that strength bias is something that has actually given me a great foundation to ultimately develop myself in the way that we have.
But then flip that on its head. Take a real good CrossFit athlete, somebody maybe at what would be considered the same level as you in CrossFit. I don't know where you would put that, but somebody who's also as good at CrossFit as you might be at hybrid training. If you then want to make them excellent at ultra endurance or the capability to do a double Ironman triathlon, then you're going to have to work back harder. It's going to be harder to develop that aerobic base, I think, from that point, without removing lots of things that they also want to do.
Yeah.
I also think,
I do. And I also, this is where, not a criticism again, but well, actually it is because I know how much value there is in doing, the reason I train the way that I do and explore outside in such a way is because there's immense value for it for me. I think the bias towards indoors and the gym environment within CrossFit is something that I disagree with a bit. I think running should be done outside. I don't think it should be done on a curved treadmill. Whilst, yes, there's practical considerations to bear in mind, I think the psychology of recreational CrossFit keeps people within the walls of the gym floor more than it otherwise should. And actually training those individual disciplines would give them value outside of just the CrossFit metrics on the board. But also I appreciate that if you put me into a Metcon, because of the lack of skills, I wouldn't last very long doing handstand walking and all these things.
You struggle with that just now because those aren't skills you developed. And actually,
so I just want to check my own bias there is my point. But
that's kind of where I was coming at it from. Oh, something's been lost here. We're back again.
I don't think you left. Sorry, I just pulled that up with my foot.
But we'll just cut that a little bit out.
That's where I was coming from.
Feet off.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree. I think if we were to put you through, a hard, fast-paced Metcon now, you're going to struggle. You'd manage it, but it wouldn't be at the same pace as you'd want to if you were a CrossFit athlete, and mostly because of the lack of exposure to it. But it wouldn't take long to develop that exposure to that, whereas the other way around, to develop a very, very good cardiovascular base or aerobic base rather, would require focus. And that would then take away from the opportunity to do these Metcons, etc., which means you would no longer be a CrossFit athlete. You would have to step off that in order to achieve this, whereas you wouldn't necessarily have to step off hybrid in order to achieve CrossFit. I think that's probably the key of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
What do you think, Phil?
I think the next few years are going to be really telling because in terms of CrossFit performance, the best athletes, say like you said, James Newbury, he comes from a triathlon background, doesn't he? Or something that's very endurance-y.
I think he was quite a good AFL player actually. I think
okay.
Yeah, I'm not completely
sure. No, I know who you're talking about now. Yeah,
Dreadlocks,
AFL.
Australian. Yeah. I think he was AFL, CrossFit. I think he was very focused on the Ironman. So the argument there is that yes, he was a CrossFit athlete, but he put the time aside to do the Ironman.
Yeah.
Again, not in any way discrediting in any sense. It's just context around.
No, he's awesome.
Oh, he's an absolute hero. Yeah. And he's actually, I think, tomorrow launching his new plant protein brand. So there we go. Just to make sure that we want to make it clear that we are a big fan. He is a great example of what happens when you apply the baseline to new demands and train specifically for it. So anyway, we cut you off, Phil. You asked about his background, and we think it's AFL.
That's really quite important. Let's use Matt Fraser as an example as well. He had that 10 years worth of weightlifting before he moved into CrossFit. So he has taken a development program over 10 years where he's developed those key skills and physical qualities, which he then took into CrossFit. So the key skills that he learned were clearly much later in his development leading to CrossFit. Now, I think a lot of the athletes, because CrossFit is technically still a relatively new sport, did the same thing. So they've come from being good in one sport, and then all of a sudden they've utilized that and redirected it towards CrossFit. But now we're starting to see athletes like Mal O'Brien, the young people coming through where they're starting to, be on the podium, but they don't have that development. They've had like a CrossFit development. So it'll be interesting to see how they've been developed, because my instinct would be during your teen years, you don't want to focus just on one area. You want to develop multi-skills, so you can redirect them however you want to. But that type of long-term thinking, I think, is good for something like hybrid training, because you can develop strength and you can develop endurance over time. And then, like Jonny said, where you start to then lead that towards a specific area where you're learning the skills. Learning the skills probably takes less time than developing those a high level of endurance capacity. Like you could do appropriate zone 2 training for like 6 months, and only then is when you start to see changes in cardiac muscle or adaptations to cardiac muscle. It takes a really long time, which people don't appreciate as much. So, developing that early is really quite important. So having like a more of a hybrid type development with a bit of skill learning would be great over like 10 years, and then go a bit more into the skill learning, a bit more into the higher intensity stuff, because that is building on all of the stuff that you've done before, the low intensity stuff, the strength stuff. I think that's probably a better way. So even though we're now going into this phase where we've got CrossFit athletes that started CrossFit when they were like 12 and get into the pro leagues now, I think it would be quite telling how they've trained, rather than, they've trained specific to CrossFit, that's why they're so good now. I think it will be how they've trained CrossFit. And I think it will have that long-term hybrid style flavor. Those are the ones that are going to be, very good in the future.
Well, it's interesting as well that you use Mal O'Brien as an example, because she's come through predominantly under the tutelage of Matt Fraser, hasn't she? And what you'll see in Matt's programming now is that he actually has, it's still not hybrid. It still doesn't sort of follow the same principles that ours does, but it takes a much bigger nod to them than CrossFit did previously. So what he has in his programming style, and anybody who wants to correct me on this, because I'm not super, haven't gone super in depth with it. I've just looked at some of the programming. It's very interesting to me, is that he'll have within a given week, it seems that his day 1 is a lower body day, and then after the lower body strength work, they go straight into some high intensity. This is a high intensity day. They'll go straight into some high intensity bike drills or something like that. And off the back of that, they do the accessory work. And now he's putting in zone 2 work on the back of that. It's optional. I guess they're not really hammering home. Maybe don't quite understand the absolute.
I wonder what the percentage of people doing that versus not doing it is. Yeah.
But where I'm going with it is that, and then the day 2 is a kind of an upper body similarity of that kind of process. And as the week gets on, there's more given. It's given over a little bit more to skill work, and he seems to work through the energy systems. The zone 2 work tends to be optional, and I think it amounted, when I added it up, it amounted to something like a total of an hour a week, which probably over time wouldn't really be enough to develop a lot more than a sort of a cursory kind of baseline uplift.
But interestingly,
it's there.
It's almost the concept of pre-fatigue in action, isn't it? That
Absolutely.
We've discussed on here.
No, it really is. And then when you look at somebody like Mal O'Brien, who's come under, and again, I'm speaking purely speculatively here, but who's come in under Matt's wing and his tutelage and his experience, and also his experience of having gone through what we've already described, of having gone through very randomized programming. And then over time, we saw even in the games that people were developing much more systemic programming understanding. They started to put in sort of periodized approaches, and then they messed with that and changed it up and all the rest of it. And so we've arrived at one of the very best, who's had one of the very best experiences, now producing his own athletes. The chances of her missing the optional zone 2 work is slim. The chances are that that's been seen as a priority, or seen as something that certainly lends itself in a key manner. So she's not going to be saying, "Oh bollocks, it's not fun. I like the high intensity stuff." She's likely to have understood from the very start. Seems like a very driven athlete as well. Understood from the very start the importance of it, and also has a coach explaining the importance of it. And therefore, we get this phenom. Now, arguably, if you see Mal O'Brien work, she is a phenom. She's clearly genetically smashed it somehow, but an excellent athlete nonetheless. So I think some of that comes from a timeline, as you've just described, Phil, of the sport having been new and fresh, and all these lessons learned then manifest in an athlete who is pure CrossFit, who also has the benefit of some extraordinary experience and some extraordinary programming learning that's gone on. And then we get this kind of new evolution of athlete, which actually leans a little bit closer to the hybrid model. Not exactly, but it's better, much better.
The evolution's been fascinating to see, because the tide has somewhat turned in terms of acknowledging that zone 2 work needs to be there, but the actual parameters for it, I haven't really seen executed to the level, because I think it's an element of psychological restraint. There's a real, I need to redline, I need to burst myself, I need to be the hardest worker in the room. That means that it just doesn't align with zone 2 training. It doesn't align
competition demands that as well, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
that's obviously going to be the key outcome, is I must go hard.
But again, football, if you're on a football pitch for 90 minutes and you're taking 150 free kicks on a Thursday night, it's a very different, very deliberated approach, isn't it? It's the exact same component. All the components build into it.
I think that's the nail on the head there. Is actually it's kind of over time learning that we want to go hard on game day, but between now and game day, every time we can learn to where the easy work becomes the intelligent work, etc.
Yeah.
I think, like I say, I think that's kind of being wrung out a little bit, and sounds incredibly patronising to say it in the manner I'm about to, but it seems like CrossFit is learning. And
that did sound patronising. Oh dear.
Just from maybe
changing.
the culture's changing.
In,
but I think
in the same way that we are from observing.
absolutely. We're all learning.
Yeah.
But what
Just to clarify.
Yeah, I guess patronising or not. I guess Phil said it just then. The culture is changing, but what they've also got. Listen, we saw this in MMA. So you initially had this isn't just my favorite thing to talk about. This is a good example of the same kind of thing happening. Is that you initially had jiu-jitsu guys who would fight boxers, or you had wrestlers who would try and fight karate guys, and all the rest of it. And it became like, not was one idea better than the other idea. That was initially the case, and then the evolution happened, which is where I moved into coaching, because I didn't have that background of having everything in the bag. The evolution happened where these guys and girls started to come through learning pure MMA, learning the whole gambit all at once, learning that actually there are different ways to manage this, etc., etc. So then you've got a sport that learned as it went, and you're able to say, as patronisingly in the same way, if I look at MMA from a strength and conditioning perspective, MMA has learned a lot and is still learning, and it's becoming better and better at managing how it treats its athletes. CrossFit's kind of the same. And I guess the age is not dissimilar in actual fact.
I think that's the main point when you say CrossFit is learning. It's fantastic to see that the sport is accelerating and changing and evolving in the grand scheme of things within the context of its lifetime at an alarmingly quick rate.
Yeah, well, it's brilliant to watch.
Because the commerciality and the popularity behind it, it means that, as you said, Phil, in the next decade, there's going to be some animal. I mean, Matt Fraser's an animal, but is anyone going to be more of an animal than Matt Fraser? I hope so, because that'll be very entertaining to watch.
I have no doubt. I'm sure he has no doubt. Yeah, I think so. I don't think they've even scratched the surface, because you'll get people who have then gone through this new evolution, who are just coming at it from a very different scientific perspective and experiential perspective that's come before them, etc., etc. So
I'm conscious we might end up in a r/CrossFit Reddit thread here getting torn to pieces. So I'm going to get one jab in before we summarise, which is please CrossFit, stop thinking that every run needs to be done in a weighted vest. It does not. That is all. So to summarise, I'm going to return back to the original nuance that we discussed earlier, and I think we'll go around the houses again. And from my point of view, the nuance is kind of as covered before, which is both practices in and of themselves develop you fantastically across the board. I think what hybrid training is lacking is some of the depth of skill set that comes with CrossFit. I think what CrossFit is lacking is a perception of how to apply zone 2 work intelligently, and actually an understanding of how to sustain that efficiency, how to sustain that pace over time, and the psychological benefits that come from being outside of the gym walls and putting yourselves in demanding environments that aren't within the context of numbers on a whiteboard. I've gained an awful lot from that personally, so I'm very biased to that. And I would love it if I saw less curved treadmills in gyms that had access to places you could run outside, because I'm not going to be a moron and say that, oh, well, obviously the curved treadmills are there because you're in the financial districts of Chicago. So I want to make that clear. But I think the difference is I think both elements can learn an awful lot from one another. Obviously, we are in a very, very small corner, small niche, so I don't want to make it sound like in any way we are trying to act high and mighty like we know any better. But from our observational point of view, we take a lot from CrossFit. We have CrossFit athletes that we have seen develop significantly by giving them more specific, less randomized, more aerobically underpinned programming, which means that when it comes to applying it on game day, the competition floor, all of the pieces are put together. So from my perspective, both have immense value, both can do things differently, but it all ultimately depends on your individual goals. Jonny, summary from your end.
Yeah, probably should take a moment to apologise for being patronising and then be patronising again. I think that CrossFit, I love it. I genuinely love it. I think it's an amazing thing to watch. The athletes are extraordinary. The whole thing, right down to the marketing and all the rest of it, it's wonderfully done. And there's some inspirational individuals involved in it. It's got a real positive feel, more so now after some controversy a year or so ago. Got some really positive people leading it. So I find it hard to pick any fault with it, if I'm honest. And the community thing's great. I do think that from a purely looking at it from a kind of a professional perspective, if I look at it with a strength and conditioning eye, I think there's probably better things that can be done. And I'm really excited to see that they do seem to be happening. And from my bias of being a sort of a hybrid coach, or certainly this is the area I love to work in, I genuinely think there are a lot of things that CrossFit could learn from looking at that approach, because our methodology is underpinned by a kind of a strong, and I'm sure Phil would agree with this, a strong understanding of the science and the principles and the application of certain energy systems and all the things that we've discussed in the previous podcast, in fact, if you want to refer back to that. So I'm excited to see how kind of conversations like this can open up and how we can all help each other and move forward, because I think it would be undeniably arrogant to suggest that there aren't things that we could learn from CrossFit. But from a purely Jonny Payne biased perspective, I think that the hybrid methodology could lend itself positively to CrossFit, and there's things that we could share.
Phil?
Yeah, I'm really excited how both sports are going to develop in the next few years. And I say hybrid training as a sport. To me, it is a sport. It's just not as formalized as CrossFit is at the moment. I think we're going to see greater records be broken in CrossFit. I think we're going to see immense records be broken in hybrid training, which I think is amazing. The slight differences are going to be really interesting to research. You know, ultimately in hybrid training, usually the endurance side of things is a bit longer compared to the short, sharp, the majority of the short, sharp type CrossFit types metcons, where they're still performing, you know, need a lot of cardiac output, but at the same time, you need a lot of muscle tension to be able to lift heavy loads to do high reps. There are differences there, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how the training is going to be different. I really think they both lend to each other. You might need to lean into one before you move into the other. So I think we'll be learning off each other greatly. And yeah, like I said, the Zone 2 stuff is starting to seep into CrossFit. So that's great to see. Ultimately, we need to move the culture away from, oh, look, you know, every gym box is taking photos of their clientele like sprawled against the floor. You know, that's
if you're not sweating, it's you haven't worked out sort of mentality, isn't it? Yeah.
Every single session.
The memory of Pukey the Clown. Does anybody remember that?
No.
Early CrossFit,
Pukey the Clown.
Pukey the Clown was a kind of a totem for. It was a thing. It was a CrossFit thing.
I know a few Pukey the Clowns.
It was just a puking clown, and it was just and it was almost cool to get close to Rabdo, wasn't it? That's gone. That's not fair to CrossFit at all.
I think the elite CrossFit guys are training very.
Yeah, I do
it just
too,
hasn't seeped down to the box level yet.
Yeah,
but it will, because that information will pass down. So it's not really a rush. But I'm really excited to see where both communities will go. And I'd like to also highlight, as a finished one, you talk about community with CrossFit, it isn't really there yet with hybrid training, because you're often on your own, but OMNIA Performance is setting that up. Like, there's a big community for hybrid training right here. So this is the start of what CrossFit has developed. So even more exciting.
Phil, you were a salesman in a past life, clearly, so I don't need to say my closing spiel. But one thing I will say is, from a generalistic point of view, there is a lot of crossover between hybrid training and CrossFit. But I think the summary I'd like to finish with is that they're probably not as closely aligned as people conventionally think.
I'd agree with that, yeah.
And hopefully this conversation has reflected that. If not, then sorry, you're not getting those 40 minutes back. And goodbye.
Goodbye.